Well, I'm excited to host another episode of the S2G podcast. I'm joined by our two co-heads of the energy investment business for us, Frank and Bala. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sanjeev.
Excited to be here.
So there is a lot of topical issues to cover. And Frank, you wrote a recent blog or post or whatever we call it these days around what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz and the current war in Iran. Maybe just for our audience, summarize this, for them, just because it provides a bit of a table setting for, I think, what we're about to talk about.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. So, I think for our generation, at least, this is a truly the first energy crisis in the true sense that we've seen, because what's playing out right now, and this is irrespective of what happens going forward, but what has already played out is uh, a disruption, a dislocation, a shock to a nexus in not just the oil system, but the entire global energy complex, global energy and global industrial complex that, has ripples and wake effect that is going to have significant, probably medium to long-term impacts. And so let's talk about that a little bit. So in the near term, obviously what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz is a disruption that's been put in place to the delivery of 20 million barrels of oil a day. That's a big issue. Now, there are mitigating mechanisms playing out right now to try and reduce that kind of disruption to that near-term flow. But, analysts out there are suggesting that regardless, and if we pull every lever we have, we're still going to be 3 to 5 million barrels short relative to where we were before the crisis. So that has an immediate effect in a system that's tightly balanced, and we're going to see that ripple through the price of liquid fuels for a period of time. The more interesting element for me, to be very honest, Sanjeev, I think, is the fact that, and people don't realize this as much, the Straits of Hormuz are also crucial in the natural gas market. Natural gas is, really the kind of hidden hero of the energy system, in that LNG in particular has become the vector for delivering energy to, many, many countries around the world. And that system is exquisitely tightly coupled and balanced. And so now we're in a situation where Qatar Energy has had two of 6 or 7 trains they've got taken offline. It's taken about 20% of their production capacity offline. And that means that the world is short of LNG and will be short of LNG for years to come, regardless of what happens, right? So we're going to see structurally higher LNG prices owing to the balance that exists in that market and the fact that Qatar has major infrastructure offline for a period. Now, what does that mean? First thing I think it means is that countries dependent on LNG that's physically sourced in the Gulf, Southeast Asia, and even into Europe, both of those countries have already seen a major uptick in their price of natural gas. And that's going to lead to real questioning about how they want to power their economies from an electrical point of view going forward. And I think actually this is creating a very interesting tailwind for alternative sources, whether it's nuclear, whether it's low carbon sources like solar or more wind. Exactly the same thing is playing out in Europe. The price of gas has doubled at the TTF in Europe in the last couple of weeks. And you're seeing, the momentum already beginning to return around the need to really focus in on our local energy independence. But I think the most interesting point might be in the US context. So the US structurally has always had, the reason we have low or cheap natural gas isn't necessarily that we have a lot of natural gas. We have lots of natural gas, but it's because we haven't been strongly linked to the other international markets where the prices were structurally higher, and it was expensive to trade that gas. But over the last decade, the US there's been a lot of change. We've begun to build LNG export capacity, and now we have meaningful LNG export capacity. We're actually the largest LNG exporter in the world. That capacity is pretty full, but we have meaningful capacity that's going to come online here in the next, let's call it 6, 12, 18 months. That capacity is going to fill the Qatari gap. And that capacity, the cargoes that flow, they are going to go at the new price for international gas. That's going to be higher, and that's going to pull real upward pressure on natural gas prices in the United States, in my view, structurally over the longer term. We are now more coupled to international gas prices. And that's going to have repercussions in terms of the cost of, obviously, gas, but more importantly, probably the cost of power from gas in the US over the medium and longer term. And that has a whole host of other repercussions in terms of the relative cost effectiveness of nuclear, of wind or solar, all, by the way, resources that we have a lot of to exploit and that are pretty cost effective already. So I think we're going to see a meaningful shift, Sanjeev, in global energy system focused design and the balance that exists between pure economics and questions around security of supply over the next while. And then the final point I would add, and we should spend some more time on this maybe later, is beyond the gas itself, gas is a key input into a whole host of crucial derivatives for the broader economy, the most obvious one being fertilizer. And we're having a major disruption in fertilizer supply globally because of this conflict as well, which will take time to play out. Right now, we're entering the planting season in North America. We're structurally short of fertilizer. There's a real question about what balance of crops are going to be planted because of that. We could find ourselves, in fact, I'm pretty certain that we're going to see real inflationary pressure into the food system flowing from all of this. And that obviously has a whole host of broader implications as well. So those are some kind of just, interesting kind of outcomes from, 2 or 3 weeks of, a minor kerfuffle in the Middle East and how it could play out for us over years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think I looked at the forward curve on the Henry Hub on Friday. It had the Jan 27 number had a 5 on it.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. And then we have a lot of tentacles in obviously the food system, and urea is up 30% since the start of the bombing. And the other thing that I don't think people appreciate is the entire sort of U.S. A lot of the food system is based on logistics and frankly trucking. So that is going to have implications on obviously diesel and logistics and food inflation. So I totally hear that. Bala, where are you seeing these things play out? And then, obviously it's only been 30 days, but what have you seen already? And where do you think we're headed?
Yeah, I'm going to make this a lot more personal. What I mean by this is 2 weeks after the Middle East conflicts arose, I called my mom, and she was complaining to me about how she did not have access to liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, which in India is distributed through cylinders. We don't have piped gas. So the conflict from the Straits of Hormuz had translated to an impact on the stoves in Chennai, which is for my entire life, my mom has told me that cooking South Indian food on an induction stove is, it's a complete no-no. And what she was doing was pulling out the induction stove from her attic and putting it to work because the security of supply of the next cylinder coming through was not there. So I think the impact, particularly from the Middle East conflict, is spread faster to the east because of what Frank alluded to, which is much of the supply was going towards the east. So we've seen Singapore jet fuel prices rocket up. We've seen Newcastle coal prices set an all-time high. Sri Lanka declared Wednesday as a public holiday. So this is some real implications on human life and livelihoods. And to Frank's point, because of how U.S. in particular is insulated to some extent, we've not seen the price hikes flow through as yet, but it's coming, and it's coming in the form of, to your point, Sanjeev, diesel prices being at $5 and gasoline prices now inching above $4. but we've seen this happen before with the Russia-Ukraine war. Europe saw this happen, prices went up, and we thought there was going to be a structurally higher price for energy security, a premium for energy security. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. That it's possible because there was more supply coming, especially from Qatar in form of LNG. So prices went back down. So we didn't really see that sort of stick for a long time. So my big question that I'm watching for is, this time around, will it be different? And this time around, will we ascribe a premium for energy security?
Yeah, I mean, Frank sent me the paper, and I always said like mean reversion, because I mean we've all seen this several times, and humans for whatever reason have a panache for status quo, mean reversion. Having said that, I think the longer this drags on, this is going to bite, and I want to bifurcate the implications in 3 geographies. One geography is broadly the actual economies that are impacted. Bala, to your point, is really East Asia and then some of the emerging markets that draw their importation. What I've heard the groupthink say is long coal, because you need security of supply, and then, but 2, a greater desire to sort of embrace all the above: solar, wind, mainly solar, battery, EV. Do you guys buy that groupthink in terms of, and we're going 3 different geographies, but the geography sort of most acutely impacted, this gives an opening, frankly, for China to come in and offer, hey, Sri Lanka, hey, geography X or Y, here's how and even before the crisis, Pakistan was deploying a ton of rooftop solar at a dramatic level. Do you believe that this could be an accelerant to that, all the above, particularly in those geographies?
I mean, it's never black or white. There's always some gray in all of these. But I say yes because I read that. I go back to induction stoves as a leading indicator here to some extent. Demand for induction stoves on Amazon India was up 30x compared to the week before the conflict arose. And to some extent, I think maybe the way I would draw the distinction is, especially in Southeast Asia, the demand for all of the above, the demand for alternative sources, is being pulled both by consumers at their level and by the government. Consumers because they wanted to add resilience, and governments because this is sort of, your fiscal deficit is going to go up, you have to protect your currency, you got to raise interest rates, which is not good. Whereas maybe in the other geographies that we'll discuss, the consumer hasn't felt the pinches yet, and therefore it's sort of, there's delayed, and therefore maybe the governments are the ones sort of leaning in today, but over time it'll happen across both.
Frank, what are your thoughts of that?
So different geographies, definitely, but I also think like different kind of ex ante circumstances. So I really think we're at a point today, Sanjeev, where if you are sitting down to build tomorrow's energy system, i.e., you have greenfield growth needs to fill, you don't make the same decisions. You don't build a system that looks like the system that we've had in the US or in Europe for decades. Bearing in mind that those systems, they really haven't been seeing very much growth for decades, right? If you take power, for example. So your Pakistan example is a great one. I think the entire continent of Africa is going to be another interesting one, right? How do you go about building for future demand? And my view is that we're going to see materially more solar in particular. I mean, different countries will take different approaches, but solar particularly effective. Solar plus storage, because solar plus storage is already a really quite a compelling solution in many contexts. If you strip away things like tariffs and so on, storage is very cost effective in many regions. I think you're going to see more electrification of transport. I mean, we see, people still buying lots of pickup trucks in the United States, but I mean, you go to Europe now, and to your point about China, Europe is full. I go to Europe, every 6 months. There's a new Chinese brand of car on the street every 6 months that I've never recognized before. And they're really high quality products. And that's not just in Europe. That's in Africa. That's all over Asia. That's in Australia. So we're and in South America, by the way. So like I think the United States, to a certain extent, maybe living in a kind of insulated little bubble, thinking, yeah, this isn't happening. The world is changing in that respect. I think for us here, things are a little bit different, obviously, because you have such an established um, stock of assets and so on. However, we're also seeing real demand growth, and I think despite what we're seeing in terms of like policy direction and so on at the moment, you're people that really need to fill capacity demand and so on right now see the rationale in building lots of solar plus storage alongside some additional gas and so on. I'd also say that, and I think this is an interesting leading indicator, the big producers of gas turbines, I think they're being very sensible this time around. They're being disciplined in terms of not putting too many products to the market. I'm not quite sure whether that's rent taking. Certainly, some of it is rent taking, but it might also be a view that the medium to longer term isn't necessarily going to be as gas centric as one would imagine. We'll see, but that's a suspicion that I have too.
Speaking of gas centric, let's move to Europe. You know, they just can't win. I mean, like Russia, and then now they had a pivot to obviously Norway, in that region, and Qatar, and to a certain extent the US. What does Europe do?
Yeah, it's tough being Europe, unfortunately, and this is where this is one of the reasons why Europe, in particular, and UK embraced offshore wind, because that was their ability to electrify at scale, in particular the power sector. But there is still, an average UK household uses 3 times as much gas as electricity, and even that electricity is powered by gas, right? I mean, so you just can't get away from gas if you're in Europe. What I've read is that much of the impacts of Russia-Ukraine war resulted in deindustrialization. So it's not that demand has ever picked up. It's gone completely, with sort of much of refineries and production and industries being shut down. So truly, they need a new version of a Green New Deal, or a New Deal to start with, to a Marshall Plan to get back to growth, get back to industrialization. But that all starts with cheap electricity. Right, and maybe this is. I mean, I was reading that even Japan is reconsidering nuclear. When you have LNG prices at wartime prices, people rethink their priorities, and this is where I go back to just priorities have changed now, which means every country should be thinking about bringing back nuclear. Every country should be embracing local oil and gas production. UK is rethinking gas production. There's plenty of resources in the North Sea, and embracing Norway in particular, because Norway is a secure supplier, and therefore being willing to do more longer-term offtake contracts with a supplier in Norway should enable Europe to get to a better footing, but it's not easy.
I think, Sanjeev, like the problem for Europe, first there's the economic problem, right? But then there's also a security of supply problem. So to Bala's point, I think, you could get back to business, drill more in the North Sea. You can certainly rely on the Norwegians, all of that's fine. But that asset or that product is ultimately going to be coupled into the global market one way or the other, and very, very difficult to shake that dependence. And so I think that what Europe needs to do is at least, and I think they're trying to figure a way to do this, but is to at least bring more decoupled electrons onto the system, and offshore wind largely. I mean, there's a lot of solar being built in Europe too, but offshore wind is and will continue to be a big vector for growth there. That will help to mitigate the worst effects of the price volatility issue. The broader issue of just pure security of supply, that's a question, I suppose, in terms of the trajectory of their overall economy. And as Bala said, are they just going to kind of, does the deindustrialization trend accelerate further? Who knows? But I think they find themselves in a really very, very tricky energy situation right now.
Maybe on
Do
a
you?
positive, sorry, maybe
Go
on a
ahead.
positive note, this is my favorite data point, especially coming out of Germany, which is prior to the Russia-Ukraine war, Germany was consenting or permitting 4 gigawatts of onshore wind. Post Russia-Ukraine war, they announced a planning reform similar to what we are trying to do in the States in terms of permitting reform. And last year, Germany permitted 16 gigawatts of onshore wind, 4 times as much as pre-Russia Ukraine. So what that tells you is that if there is a will, there is a way, and this was done clearly with the intent of security of supply, to Frank's point, and more countries should be sort of leaning in on this to unlock energy resources that are decoupled from international markets.
Yeah. I might add, I mean, I think that's a great example. The bigger, I would say, all of this, by the way, is suffering from a huge degree of kind of there's been like decades worth of ambivalence that has been allowed to build up in terms of institutional programs and capacity and process around energy and energy security, right? And in Europe, I see this all the time. I mean, in our own little part of the world, my own little part of the world in Ireland, fantastic example. Ireland has been talking about building a offshore wind for as long as I've been like an adult, and it has a fantastic offshore wind resource, and it still hasn't managed to get a commercial facility in the water. And that's a little country that sits out there with one single connection to the natural gas grid in the UK as its only alternative. The entire economy is sensitive to a compressor in Scotland. That's it. And it's crazy. But that mindset has allowed or has evolved from the kind of broader complacency politically that, the last 20 or 30 years of our lives certainly have allowed. And everything has now changed. So I think there needs to be a truly kind of politically driven focus on, hey, the old rules are no longer relevant. We need to build things, we need to stop judicial reviews for every small Mickey Mouse point. There is a collective need and a collective good that has to be focused on. Because what you've seen in many countries, I mean, take building a transmission line, for example, we need to build a lot of transmission, but it is nearly impossible now. And that's always because there's some, individual property right issue. Fair enough, but there is this kind of challenge of what's the collective good relative to that single issue, and how do you strike that balance? So all of that is now on the table. It's certainly a whole host of more dynamic, there's just so much more dynamic now than it was over the last 20 or 30 years, I think.
Yeah, the other thing that I've tried to learn more about it and see if there's a theory of change around is, can you couple sort of this energy diversification with industrial defense policy, which I think has broadly got consensus, and as NATO continues to weaken as a core thing, that could be the best thing that happens to Europe, and could, Frank, to your point, create a crisis and to build, and you pair an industrial defense complex that for Europe, by Europe, with an energy transition. That could be a theory of change, TBD, to the point that we've all seen in our careers. And I think all three of us have lived and worked in Europe, and hopeful, but yeah, TBD. I want to bring us back to the US. Obviously we've got a lot of just intelligence from our own portfolio, our own co-investment partners, our strategics, et cetera, et cetera. What I want to get to a little bit first is, I've heard this thesis that we're just like, and Frank, I want to go to you because you literally wrote the paper on this, is we've got a ton of shale gas, it's infinite, and therefore we're good. We're totally, and I want to get to the LNG point, but do we have infinite flow of shale gas?
So in the concept of resource economics, there's the technically recoverable resource and the economically recoverable resource, and then there is the resource. And the resource is a spectrum that is enormous, truly enormous. The technically recoverable resource and the economically recoverable resource, Sanjeev, these are coupled dynamics. And typically how it works is when prices increase enough, you're able to spend more on the technology to broaden the technically recoverable resource. And shale gas is exactly that, right? So to be clear, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, shale gas was not considered a technically recoverable resource. It certainly wasn't an economically recoverable resource. And we were producing gas from fields in the Gulf of Mexico that had permeabilities in the millidarcy range. I don't want to be too technical here, but just bear with me. So millidarcy.
Nerd out.
We got to nerd out, right? So that's how easy it was for the gas to flow through the rock. Basically view it as a sponge, right? It's effectively a pipe, actually, just a framework through which the gas could flow. The shale has, even good shale, has microdarcy permeability. So 1,000 times less capacity to flow gas. And that's why we have to frack it, et cetera, et cetera. So it is definitively a worse resource. But if you're willing to spend more to put more energy into it, you can get that energy out. And that's exactly what played out, because, you know, when the shale boom really took off, prices of gas were actually $8, $9, $10. We were going to be a huge LNG importer, if you remember.
Yeah, Greenspan went on in front of the Senate and said we need to build all the LNG import facilities we can.
So suddenly we figured out, oh, we might have a lot of gas in these rocks. And so, you know, you saw this huge boom. The boom is like classic, bit like, you know, clean energy investing and so on. A huge amount of money rolled into it. I'll be very honest with you. I don't think very much equity value at the primary extraction level was created. But what it did do, obviously, was provide for the nation a resource base now that's much more expanded. Same story with the oil and tight oil. We are producing a lot of oil now, but we're producing oil from really very marginal rock, relatively speaking, right? So we need the prices to be pretty high for them to work anyway. And I think that, you know, that's a continuing, that, you know, none of that's going to change. This is a one-way direction kind of process here. But if we move into a world, Sanjeev, where the US gas price is coupled more tightly to international gas prices, we will have more than enough gas in the system in order to deliver into that market for a long, long time to come. I think that the question is, though, do we have a lot of cheap gas? And the answer there is, I don't think we have that much cheap gas. We've built a lot of gas. The gas prices have been relatively low, but I don't think we have that much cheap gas. And very specifically, we have a lot of gas today that's coming about just because it's being co-produced from oil. Now, if that oil production wasn't taking place, you would not be producing that gas, and the price of gas would need to be higher in order to supply that gas.
Which is where we sat pre this war.
Completely.
For like 2 years, I would like just call Frank on weekends or nights and be like, you know, particularly with Russia, Ukraine, like, does gas go from local regional pricing, which we've all lived through, to some sort of global couple similar to oil? Effectively has some coupling to the global markets. Obviously 2 or 3 different benchmarks, principally 3. Where are you on this? Because do you think this is as important as I'm making it? Like the understanding where the gas price sits.
Yeah. Yes, for 2 reasons. One, I mean, I look at sort of other examples of what has happened in other countries. Let's take the example of Australia here. Australia is a huge exporter of LNG. What effectively happened as a consequence of them exporting so much LNG was that they were importing international LNG prices into their domestic markets. And soon enough, the domestic, you know, whether it's steel, aluminum, all of the industrial companies were like, holy crap, why am I paying this much amount for my gas? You need to reserve gas for local domestic production. You need to guarantee us prices which are lower than international markets. And that resource, you know, nationalism to some extent, that trend started in a big way. And I think it's still there in Australia to a large extent. One of the first things that I think post-conflict that I saw from the US administration announced is that we will not be curtailing exports of oil, because you can naturally see where that was heading towards. So we're at a time when the demand for gas has never been higher, in particular because of demand from data centers, right? And much of the data center needs are being met by gas. So far, we've lived under the presumption that hyperscalers in particular are marginal buyers, marginal buyers who are relatively price insensitive. But if gas prices double, will they still remain price insensitive is a big question. Hence, the importance of knowing how much of gas inflation will we be bringing into our shores is critical. Maybe the last point here is, I mean, I don't see that directly impacting residential customers as yet, because much of our bill is linked to cost to serve, then cost of energy, and that has a lag, and over time that's not a huge driver. But certainly from an industrial perspective, that'll have more near-term implications.
The biggest sort of fashionable thing. Oh, go ahead.
There's one thing before we finish on that, Sanjeev, just state is this is a little bit like the argument about putting tariffs on solar panels. The higher gas prices in the US is effectively, because we link into the global market, is effectively a tariff on US value add use of that gas, relatively speaking. We make much more money, and there's much more economic advantage to doing things with very cheap gas than there is selling the marginally more expensive gas. And so I do wonder, it'll be an interesting question over the next 10, 15 years as to kind of whether or not that's a good thing for us to be producing more expensive gas, and whether it's shipping it elsewhere or whatever. What does that mean for the industrial advantage that the US has had for a long time?
One fashionable thing, particularly the last 12, 18 months, has been, hey, the easy button is gas because of dispatchability and reliability. Do you think our friends in data center land will be like, how do we, if it's got a 5 on it or something, will we come up with new new design metrics or new design features that maybe has, are we still, betting on gas because of dispatchability and reliability?
I don't know, Bala, your thoughts on this. I mean, my view is, a 5 handle is not a problem for these guys, to be very candid. If it was a 15 handle, I think that might be more, or certainly a 10 handle, that's more interesting. But I think the data centers, Sanjeev, they have a bigger problem in that they just can't get the power. They would take that power any which way they can get it for a period of time. Now, 5 years down the line, the question is what's the marginal value of that next data center? That might be materially different, because I do think if we step all the way back, not to dive into data center land too much, there is already a shift beginning to emerge, beginning to reflect on whether or not data centers are actually this kind of, is it a tech product or is it actually some sort of infrastructure product? I think we're going to veer more towards its infrastructure. And as we move towards infrastructure and just, the plumbing of the economy, then I think the cost of the input energy is going to become more and more relevant over time.
Yeah. Well, as we do this collective magical thinking around the token economy, the highest conviction thesis I have, and it's high conviction for me, is physical AI and autonomy. And one of the places I have that is in electrification of transport, because I just think it just makes, the math is just ICE engines just can't compete if you're doing 80 to 100,000. Where do you see that playing out in terms of mobility, in electrification and EVs and fleets and other things? Is this an additional tailwind on top of the physical AI, or is this episodic and mean reversion will happen and oil goes back to 65, 70, and is this a temporary lift to that thesis, or how do you think about mobility and transport and electrification?
Yeah, autonomous vehicles is a huge tailwind for electrification, but one that has emerged, to your point, in the last sort of 12, 24 months. People knew it was coming, but the speed at which people have adopted autonomous vehicles and ride, in particular in rideshare, has surprised many and will continue to surprise many. So I think there is clearly an inherent demand, and that's backed by incredibly well-capitalized players. So this is not a trend that is sort of, and this administration and the previous administration have been in favor. So I see all signs pointing towards more of it, and therefore that driving electrification. Setting that aside, fleet electrification has gone through a fairly challenging time over the last sort of 2 years, right? And the recent spike in gas prices would certainly capture the attention of fleet owners. But for durable adoption to happen, you need to know whether the OEMs are behind it at scale, whether charging reliability works. So I don't think anybody is rushing to buy electric vehicles just because gasoline prices today are at 5. But certainly they are dusting out the math and making sure they're looking at it again, and certainly maybe pausing buying ICE vehicles now and thinking about secondhand EVs as a potential option. So this is an incredible tailwind for electrification. And one, I mean, if you're the CEO of Big Oil, the last thing you want is a crisis like this, because you were literally at the point in time where people were not talking about net zero. The whole green thing had sort of not died. It's died, but certainly had gone away from the zeitgeist to some extent. And just then you have price hikes, which will eventually result in adoption of newer technologies. Every customer who moves from an ICE vehicle to an EV is one that you've lost forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is never coming back. So I'm sort of putting a circle on this to some extent to say, even Big Oil hates this, despite the fact that they're making tons of money, and hence electrification around autonomous vehicles is here to stay, but fleet electrification not yet.
Are there any, like, just a jump off for both of you, like, is there anything that's like off the headlines or non-obvious that you think, oh, this could actually like spur investment in this or reduce demand in that? Like, is there anything that you're seeing either through our work in the portfolio or new pipeline of investing or just discussions with strategics or co-investors that are like, hey, I didn't think this was occurring?
I was talking to a friend of mine in New Jersey who said he put rooftop solar because he knew that the utilities in New Jersey in particular were raising electricity bills by 40%. This had nothing to do with tax credits, nothing to do with, he was like, the economic case made sense, and therefore I adopted rooftop solar. To some I think behind the meter energy efficiency solutions so far have always struggled because the economic case was sort of marginal, and were reliant on tax credits. If we believe, and we've been in this camp of there is higher for longer power prices, utility rates are going up, and with this geopolitical shock and higher, that's staying even higher, potentially there might be a much bigger tailwind for energy efficiency, behind the meter solutions, and distributed energy resources more broadly.
I'd also add, Sanjeev, I mean, quite aside from, just there being a range of niche, I won't say necessarily very niche, but niche applications where electrification now is just the right option relative to, let's say, a fossil fuel sourced solution. I think that one trend we're seeing a lot now, not quite in the US, although that's changing in the US too, but certainly in Europe, is the value of standalone storage is now being framed in terms of its capacity value, as opposed to what a lot of the store, particularly standalone storage, has spent a lot of its life trying to be like an arbitrage exercise, and that's a bad idea in general because it'll be arbitrage until you kill the arbitrage. But now, very sensibly, people are beginning to see the value in what storage really is, which is a bucket that you can put some energy into. And there's a willingness to pay for that capacity. So in Germany, for example, they've had quite an immature utility scale battery space. They haven't had great rules around it and so on, market structures. That's changing rapidly. They have many hours where the price of power is upside down badly, and power traders and so on are seeing the value of just having capacity contracts in place with storage, tolling batteries effectively, which is really helping to accelerate that value. And it's also importantly for us as investors, it's putting in place a new framework where I think you can make a more considered, less risky bet on a portfolio of storage assets. I think what's playing out right now more broadly in the kind of energy upheaval is only going to accelerate that. And here in the States, similarly, you're seeing obviously lots of solar being built, but all that solar is coming with a battery now, and all that battery capacity is there in order to provide capacity. I saw a fascinating graph a few days ago. Batteries provided 50% nearly of the power, instantaneous power in California a few days ago during the ramp down in solar and the ramp up in gas. And that's exactly what they should be doing. So I think we're going to see the role of storage really coming to the fore, the flexibility that it offers the system really being exploited more. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think in terms of just a system level, some of the things that I think are going to happen is, and certainly our colleagues believe this in the ocean side, this is probably the greatest vector for ocean intelligence mapping and understanding. Particularly, it's going to be a huge sort of capex spend from both defense and other applications. I think in the food system, certainly, urea and alternatives to that, or there's a tailwind there. Logistics issues, a huge issue there. Interestingly, though, also there's a, we and I know some people, it divides the masses, but there's a lot of interest in sort of, renewable and fuels from a biomass perspective. I think they're trying to learn the lessons of the last time we tried it, but still, I think there's a greater interest, particularly in the emerging markets. To your point, Bala, around some of the core, like just functional things that folks need. So it doesn't, although this started as an energy crisis, it has implications beyond that, just given how core it all is from a systems perspective, to the point around, useful energy turning into useful materials.
I mean, as a slightly, I won't say controversial comment, but
let's end with that. I like it.
Well, I would question really. I would say it's fair to say that the current U.S. administration has really kind of led a refocusing on priorities for the energy system and so on. And again, that can be debated till the cows come home, but it is what it is. But I think quite interestingly, what's currently playing out right now may in fact I kind of lead to a more collective reframing and reimagining of how we approach our broader energy system in a way that might be much more effective than anything that the Paris Accord or whatever was able to deliver. So, this is a moment without a doubt in the energy history of our careers, I think. I think there are a number of different directions that things could go from here, but I think that whatever the direction is, it's going to look quite different, I think, in 10 years than what the status quo was 2 months ago.
With that, you have the last word, Frank.
I'm good with that. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2ginvestments.com.